They're asking me, we've worked very closely with the manager, and she just wants to know so she can determine how much staff to keep. A lot of staff. Like, raise your hand if you might eat here at the hotel. Okay, so I'm going to tell her, like, call in extra. Okay, I'm going to let James Tabor, Dr. Tabor is going to introduce Ralph Buntyn. So, Dr. Tabor.
Okay. So are we on?
We're on. Are we going out live audio video?
Okay, everybody. Hello again. Before I introduce Ralph, I want to explain something. Everybody ready to start? And this is to our audience worldwide as well as all of you here. We decided a few years ago, conferences have registration fees and so forth, and we just dropped all of that. Registration fees don't do much anyway. To put this on is a few $1,000s, and so we just asked that people coming and others who couldn't come contribute. And Timothy, where are you? Timothy is the guy that looks like Poseidon back there. He's easy to spot. Just walk around till you see Poseidon, or Zeus, or Jesus, I don't know. I would say Moses. I'm going to go with Moses. Or King David. King David. So when you see King David, you can hand him a check or cash or whatever, and it'll go for, you can designate a donation anytime you want, but a portion of it would go to carry our meeting costs. We think that's a lot better to do it that way. And we have people donating already, like this coffee service and all. We have a lot of wonderful, generous people. So we're now going to have Ralph Buntyn, and I'm going to read his introduction to you. Ralph Buntyn is the Executive Vice President and Associate Editor of United Israel World Union. He's an author, historian, and researcher. His many articles and essays have appeared in various media outlets, including the Jerusalem Post, United Israel Bulletin, and the Southern Shofar, which is this Jewish newspaper, wide circulation. After a distinguished career with the Fortune 500 company, he retired as Senior Vice President of Marketing in 2003. Look up Motion Industries, it's pretty amazing. As a member of the state business delegation, this is Alabama, he was responsible for developing joint economic trade opportunities between the state of Alabama and the state of Israel. He was instrumental in efforts leading to the passage of Alabama House of Representatives Resolution HJR 36, supporting the Embassy 3000 campaign to encourage the nations of the world to recognize United Jerusalem as the eternal capital of the state of Israel and to move their embassies in Israel to Jerusalem. I can add that he met Prime Minister Netanyahu with the governor, and Netanyahu knew David Horowitz very, very well, because you can imagine he was the young delegate to the UN. And if you watch some of those videos, boy, he was a firebrand back then. He still is in a way, but you look at him in his 20s and 30s. And he and David had his office on the third floor of the UN. He was president of the press corps. And Bibi would come up and just sit, and David gave him a lot of advice. He looked to David as a father, a spiritual father. You're going to read all about that in Ralph's book. It's very, very interesting. And David had so many other things that he did. He didn't always blow his horn, as we say. And now that we've learned more, I think has a big responsibility for the steps to the state of Israel, as you're going to learn. So back to Ralph. I can't distinguish the two in a certain way because the biography is overlapping. Ralph is a past member of the International Council for Jerusalem-based Root and Branch Association, if you remember Aryeh Gallon. There he served as international co-chairman on Torah, economics, and business. Ralph is the author of the recently published book, The Book of David, chronicling the life of David Horowitz, Dean of United Nations Press Corps and founder United Israel World Union. So what I'm going to say about the book before Ralph comes up, and we're going to do some other things together after his presentation. But what I'm going to say personally is this is such a dream come true, because before we had this book, it was difficult to give the elevator speech for United Israel World Union, and this is much more than the elevator speech. This is the whole story. But, we had our little brochures you've seen, and we had printing materials, but the word was not really getting out, because first of all, Horowitz is a pretty common name within Jewish leadership. The editor of the Jerusalem Post is named Horowitz. He spells it a little differently. There's the politician Horowitz. There's several New York Horowitzes, and people are like, oh, yeah, I think I've heard of them. And you look on your face, they don't know. They don't know. It's just like, yeah, I think I've heard of David Horowitz. Well, this is going to make such a difference, and it is making such a difference. We're putting it in the hands of rabbis, of diplomats, of leaders in Israel. When you can give something of this quality and this beauty, it really stands out. I think this is the most significant development in United Israel in the last 76 years. I'm talking about a single thing that you can just point to. There have been many developments, but just the thing that you could say, oh, this happened, because you can see that it's going to help us to really communicate the vision. Now, Ralph will be humbled by that introduction, I know, but he deserves to take it all. Come on, Ralph.
Thank you, James. By the way, I think I'm a little too close to this. Can you hear me okay in the back? Is that too loud? If we're getting feedback, is this okay?
Let me say one more thing. Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. I'm being preempted here, so just bear with me.
Well, I want Ralph to push his book, but I want to explain that he has generously made clear that any proceeds, and that means all you people watching too that order this book, it goes back to United Israel in order to distribute copies to thousands of people. In other words, he's one of these authors, and remember Paul Newman was like that. Of course, Paul Newman had a lot more money than Ralph. But remember, when he would put out his products, he would say, all the proceeds go to this or that cause. Other people have done that as well. So to me, that just takes a certain thing off being an author, because some people, he's just trying to push his book. Guess what? He's trying to push his book, but because of what's in it, not because of anything to do with money, because all the money is going to go back to circulating the book. So I just wanted to say that. That way you can push it all you want. And thank you for being generous with that.
Thank you, James. Okay, I can push it, right? Okay, I've been given a free hand here, by the boss. But anyway, thank you. And by the way, that was a marvelous talk this morning, James. Was that good or what? That was so good. I said this about James last year, and I'll say it again. This man really does have a future in this. He's gonna make it. I mean, he's got great potential. I'm high on him. Boy, have you ever watched The Voice? And how the singers get the accolades about, you're just going to go, you're going to go far. Well, James is going to go far, so thank you. I'd also like to add my welcome this morning to everyone in attendance, to all the newbies, to the new people that are here for the first time. I had the opportunity of meeting some of them, and that's just such a pleasure. And we thank you for being here, and also for the old seasoned union members that just mean so much to us, and their support and being a part of the organization. It just dawned on me that 1 year from now, 1990 will be 30 years ago. Let that sink in a minute. When I think of 30 years ago, I think of 1970. That's, but old folks think that way, by the way. So, good morning to everyone. Good morning. 27 years ago this month, I had an appointment at the United Nations in New York City. It was a beautiful spring day. It was April, and I went to the UN. I cleared security. I went at security. There waiting on me was a press pass. And my own press pass, I have many of them. You know, you do too, from going to see David, and I've kept them. And I was escorted by a security agent up to the busy third floor press section of the Secretariat building, room 373. The door was open. I went over and I knocked and I kind of stuck my head in the door. And rising from behind his desk to greet me, coming around the desk was this slightly built, silver-haired dean of the United Nations Correspondence, David Horwitz. And James Tabor and I had begun to communicate in the early 90s, and I think it was in 1990 when I first wrote him. And we were back and forth, and this was during the days that James was involved in his work, wonderful work, Genesis 2000. And we communicated, and out of that communication, the name David Horwitz had come up, and I got it somehow, and I wrote David. I was still in business back then, and I traveled to New York frequently, had clients in New York, and it was one of the places that I spent time. And I wrote to David, and I think I mentioned James, and I mentioned that I would come to New York frequently, and also asked him to place me on his mailing list for the United Israel Bulletin. Well, in less than 2 weeks, I had this nice note back from David, typed, formal. Banged it out on that little old Underwood typewriter, mechanical typewriter. We have it in the archive. We have it at the archives. Well, David wrote me back, and it was, "Dear Mr. Buntyn," you know, and he talked, "I'll be happy to add you to the mailing list." And he said a few things, and he said, "The next time you're in New York on business, do give me a ring." He said, "I'd love to meet you and exchange views." Yeah. So it's very, very, very formal. So that note led to an appointment of destiny for me that had a significant impact on my life. Yeah, I continued to communicate with David on a regular basis and visited New York. I was there frequently. I would see him. I would always build some time in the schedule. We'd go down and have lunch together at the cafeteria in the Secretariat building. There were times I would see David at his apartment. We would stay up and talk, and like James, we just, we spent a lot of time with him. But I became involved with UIW in various ways, and along with James, agreed to take a leadership role in United Israel in a little 1973 Sukkot meeting with David at his little cottage in New Jersey, just the three of us, and talked about the future of UIWU and the opportunity to advance it and move forward. So that's kind of a snapshot of how I became involved. Now, from that background, I want you to fast all the way forward. 5 months ago, Chiron Publishing Company released the book of David. So I've titled my talk today, "A Lasting Legacy, a Case for the Book of David." It's about a Swedish-born American, a Jewish man raised in an Orthodox setting, whose remarkable life included an unparalleled legacy as the Dean of United Nations Correspondence and the founder of this wonderful organization, United Israel World Union. I want to open my comments by simply reading the first paragraph from my introduction to the book. As World War II drew to a close, there were three things not yet in existence: United Israel World Union, the United Nations, and the State of Israel. By the end of 1948, one person would be involved in establishing all three. His name is David Horowitz, and for the next 54 years, he would devote his life to all three causes. And this morning, I would like to suggest several good reasons why we have the Book of David. Reason number one, I wanted it to provide that long-awaited sequel to David's autobiography, 33 Candles. I'd like to also read a little segment of David's book, 33 Candles. This is the original. This is the first edition. This was first published in 1949. It would be later republished in 1956. So this is reading from the original. And this was at a time when David's life had been redirected, if you will. And he was writing about that experience, and he was just before founding United Israel World Union. So he's writing about himself and his feelings and his work, and he says this: "It was during these 4 months that the writer was inspirited to begin the writing of this book. Basing it upon a bountiful supply of data and diaries, he continued to work on it, among his many activities, for about 4 years. During this interim, as one historic global event after another shook the world, United Israel World Union grew and spread. Indeed, so many things have happened since its inception that a complete sequel to the book could and probably will be written." It's a prophet. Now, thank you. Thanks. Thank you. David again called for a sequel when he published the 1956 second edition. That was 1956, because he stated this: "Much has occurred on the world scene since 1944. So we wanted to reiterate the point that a lot's happened, and we really need to write this down. Now, others have suggested the notion of a sequel. One of them was his son, prominent San Diego attorney Herbert Solomon, who strongly encouraged it, wanted to help fund it. Right after David died. It really kind of never got off the ground, but I know Herb really pushed for a sequel to it. David's longtime assistant, Greg Citron. Greg kept copious notes and files over the years with the thought that he himself might provide a historical follow-up at one point. And we do have those. We have those in the archives. And for a number of years, James and I have discussed the need for such a sequel. So it was always kind of in the back of our minds. And I'm happy to say that now finally, the book of David fulfills this need, and it fulfills David's wishes for the rest of the story. As I mentioned in the book, I began writing the book in 2014, and it was published on November 1st, 2018, 4 years later. And by the way, I want to take a minute to express my heartfelt thanks to several unnamed people in this room who provided continued encouragement and a measure of inspiration through this whole process to me, and it meant a lot because if you've ever written a book, and many of you have, and some of you are about to, it's trying. It's trying. A writer struggles to get started. I found that out. It was just me and page one, and it was blank. And of course, 50,000 other documents. And writer Margaret Atwood once said, "The waste paper basket was my friend. It was invented for me by God." Well, I discovered that. And I also discovered you only become a good writer by writing. So my advice to those that have books underway And of course, James is an old hand at this. I mean, he could teach us all. But I see his effort and the length of time and all that he's pouring into a book, like the book of Mary. I think seems like he's been writing it for 6 years.
4 years.
But it's been 4 years, time to publish, 4-year intervals. But so my advice to others is write. Just write. Do it. Do it again. Do it better.
Paragraph a day.
Yes, do it better. If you fail, fail better. Just do it. The wastebasket's there for you, okay? So it took me 4 years. It also took David Horowitz 4 years. I just mentioned that he wrote about it. 4 years to write and publish his autobiography, 33 Candles. And each book was published 69 years apart. Reason number 2, the Horowitz legacy. Now, let me frame this legacy for you a little bit. In the year 1903, when David Horowitz was born, Henry Ford founded the Ford Motor Company. When the first Model A rolled off the assembly line, you could purchase the 2-seater version for $800. This is the year David was born. Now, the 4-seater cost you a little more. It was $900. But that included an option for a top. By the time David passed away in 2000, the world had experienced World War I, World War II, nuclear power, space exploration, nationalism and decolonization, and the tragic events of 9/11 that happened just 1 year before David's death. David Horowitz was truly a witness to a century, the 10th and the final century of the second millennium. And what a life he lived, folks. I want to give you just a few snippets. I want to take the time to just kind of throw this out. In 1924, the steamship SS Madonna anchored in the Bay of Jaffa. Now, Jaffa didn't have a port at that time, and the passengers and all the luggage, while the steamship was anchored offshore, had to be rowed ashore by local Arabs. This was 1924. A young 21-year-old man by the name of David Horowitz was on that ship, going to Palestine, British help Palestine for the first time in his life to become a young pioneer. David spent years on a kibbutz. He immersed himself in the study of Hebrew. He explored the country, including the wilderness of Judea in 1925 and in the Arava region all the way to Masada. Now, he went there not as you and I go today in air-conditioned coaches. His mode of transportation was horseback and hiking. He hiked to the top of Masada for the first time in his life. He wrote about it in his book. And he couldn't find the way up, and you had to hike up. It was the only way to get to the top. It's a little different now. You've got the lift. But he had remembered that Josephus wrote about 2 ways of reaching the top of Masada. One was called the snake path because of the winding path. And David said, we found it, and that's the path we took up. So, I mean, no paved steps, you know. He stood in the presence of history. David was present at the official opening of Hebrew University on Mount Scopus in April 1925. Now, what was significant about that, the opening of the university? Well, he witnessed Lord Balfour, who had issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Lord Balfour opened the ceremonies. Also present was Field Marshal Sir Edmund Allenby, who had liberated Jerusalem in 1917. He was also present. They both spoke, and David was there to hear that. By the way, Hebrew University's first board of governors included Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, Martin Buber, and Chaim Weizmann. Now, all these events and much, much more, of course, is chronicled in David's book, 33 Candles. So how many of you read 33 Candles? I mean, you know, It's been long out of print. You can't find it anymore. We're still fortunate to have some extra copies, and those that want to read the first part of the story, if you haven't read it, it's a strange and winding tale, but it's really one man's pursuit of God. Like he said, I went there to seek God in the open. Is the way he would put it. So, but now the book of David chronicles the second half of this life after it was profoundly redirected in 1944. It's the period, and what I covered in this book, it's the period covering his journalistic career at the United Nations, his profound influence in the founding and defense of the State of Israel and the founding of United Israel World Union. Now, I'd like to take a few minutes and mention some of the highlights of this outstanding period that David lived in, the second half, and the things he wrote about it. And these are snippets. I go into much more detail in the book, but I just want to throw out a flavor for it. In the mid-1940s, David had a path-breaking 2-year correspondence with King Abdullah I of Jordan. We have those copies of those letters in our archives. He wrote him about the notion of peace between the children of Abraham. And they exchanged. King Hussein's grandfather. And the old king would later be assassinated in Jerusalem at prayers at the mosque, and at his side was his 15-year-old grandson who would go on to become King Abdullah I, who remembered it so well. As a matter of fact, King Abdullah, at 15-year-old, he took a bullet. He glanced off a medal. It hit the medal and glanced off, and it was a medal given to him by his grandfather. The old king would later be assassinated by radicals because they feared he would make a separate peace with Israel. His grandson, King Hussein, the 15-year-old that was by his side, would later become king and do that very thing. He would make a peace pact with the state of Israel. Now, David treasured those letters, and he would proudly say this about them. Here you can read the first dialogue of our time aimed at bringing peace between Jews and Muslims. It's in the book. And a little-known fact, in 1947, United Israel World Union actually submitted its own proposal to a special UN fact-finding committee on the Palestinian issue. I bet you didn't know that. It was based on what the Bible and the Quran had to say about the original arrangement and boundaries. David Horowitz submitted that to that committee at the UN, and it was duly acknowledged. The 4-page memorandum was duly acknowledged by the chairman of the committee and by the Secretary General himself. Now, of course, the proposal was not adopted, and not many have since then on the Palestinian issue, but here's the point. It will always remain in the UN official records that United Israel World Union offered its own peace plan in the early days of what David called the controversy over Zion. Of course, there's the account of David also influencing a sitting president when the new state of Israel was recognized in May of 1948. It took President Truman only 11 minutes to formally recognize Israeli independence. And he did so over the objections of his State Department, the Pentagon, and the CIA, which all opposed the founding of the Jewish state. He took that kind of stand, and he took that kind of heat. Moving on, there was David's passionate effort to expose and bring to justice Nazi war criminals that resided in the United States. A couple of the stories are in the book. Yeah, thanks. The book relates how David had been instrumental in reactivating a case against the notorious Romanian Nazi war criminal bishop. He had become a bishop in the U.S., Valeran Trifa. It finally resulted in Trifa's deportation. But David launched that campaign to have the Justice Department consider reopening the war crimes charges against Trifa, who came to the United States under the Displaced Persons Act in 1950. Now, David's investigative reporting took him to Romania, where he unearthed much of the background from agency files and from personal interviews. Also took him to Israel, where he interviewed many of the witnesses that were still living to Trifas' crimes. He searched databases. He made counseling phone calls. Now, I have to say this, from knowing David, from reading his writing, from being through all of this, and those of you who know David will know exactly what I'm about to say. He was a tireless worker. He had bulldog tenacity. He had a he was tenacious in his approach. When David got onto something, he was not going to let it go. And it was just a part of his defining skills as a hard-nosed reporter. And that's what he was. He called Archbishop Trifa a wolf disguised in a bishop's robe. Printed that in the bulletin. It was a pretty high-profile case at the time, and elements of the Trifa case were the topic of an episode of the documentary series Forensic Files that aired on U.S. television stations in 2001. Then there was the later case of another Hungarian, and I want to pronounce his right name, Ferenc Kora, that David exposed. But this one was different. This one fought back. In the summer of 1977, Horowitz received some shocking news. Kora had filed a $3 million libel suit against David for slander, and he had hired the high-powered Wall Street firm of Cadwallader, Wickersham, and Taft to represent him. Now, this really disturbed David. He was livid. He was distressed. Then he happened to remember an old friend by the name of Paul O'Dwyer. Paul O'Dwyer was a prominent attorney in the law firm of O'Dwyer and Bernstein, and he'd known David since the early years of the Jewish underground when Menachem Begin was heading up the Irgun. They went back that far. Paul O'Dwyer was this prominent attorney. His brother, by the way, had one time been mayor of New York. And O'Dwyer had just run for his second term as president of the New York City Council. And it's a post he had served for 5 years. Well, he was beaten in his bid for re-election. He was defeated by Carol Bellamy, and he returned to his law practice. One of his first calls after he returned was from an old pal named David Horowitz. Now, O'Dwyer wrote a book, and it's a wonderful book. If you ever can get your hands on one, it's called Counsel for the Defense by Paul O'Dwyer. O'Dwyer recalls that conversation in that autobiography. He devoted an entire chapter to this defense of David in his own autobiography. And I will quote verbatim from Paul O'Dwyer's book. David calls him, and David says, "Look, I know you didn't want to lose the election, but I think God's made you available to me." "What's up, David?" I ask. "I need you. I'm being sued for libel." "Do you have a defense, David?" "The best in the world." "What's your defense?" "Truth." He was a Nazi. Now, I want to pause there and say, in O'Dyer's book, David actually used a more colorful description. He was a Nazi, and I want you to make him eat the tons of paper he served on me. But I got to warn you, he's got Cadwallader, Wickersham, and Taft on his side. "All right, David, come on down and tell me again the story of David and Goliath." O'Dwyer said, "It was as if I had never been away." So just an interesting story. Well, bottom line is, in a process that took years, Kora was stripped of his American citizenship by a U.S. District Court in Newark, New Jersey in June of 1994, and he was ordered deported. David Horowitz spent 60 years in journalism, all at his post at the UN. He called it the Parliament of Man. He always believed in the UN. David always believed in the UN. He believed in its foundational precepts, built to support international peace and security, justice, human rights, responsible social and economic development, and responsible stewardship of our planet and our environment. David believed in all that, and he believed in the purpose of the UN, but he also realized it was flawed, badly flawed, but that it was still, in his words, necessary to avoid the tragic failures of the past. The UN emerged from a dark and frightening period of history, born out of the Holocaust of World War II. World War II took over 60 million casualties. 60 million. It's a lot of zeros. Many millions more died from disease, injuries, starvation. Here's a quote by David. He said, "The ideal of the Assembly of Nations is the future of the world. It exists to promote international cooperation, and it's still in its infancy." Dag Hammarskjöld, the greatest Secretary General the UN has ever known, famously said that the United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. By the way, David Horowitz and Dag Hammarskjöld had a special relationship. They had a deep mutual respect for each other. The fact that they were both Swedes gave them great personal chemistry and a great working relationship. And that lasted until Hammarskjöld's tragic death in 1961 and the closure that finally David would find on a little farm in the village of Backakra in Sweden 4 years later. I'll let you read the story in the book. But the relationship was a relationship of the tale of two Swedes, and they both left an incredible legacy at the UN. Now, capturing this legacy was the task that I undertook in the fall of 2014. The book of David not only brings these remarkable stories into the light of day for many, but I believe elevates David's achievements to a level that he so richly deserves. Reason number 3, it gives us a documented history of United Israel World Union. The book provides the only completely documented story of the history of United Israel World Union, compiled from thousands of United Israel bulletins, records, and UN documents. It offers the only unfolding chronological history of the organization from its founding to the present day. When I wrote the book of David, I asked James would he write the foreword to it. And when James wrote in his foreword, he gave what I thought was one of the best descriptions of our organization that I'd ever read. Best description of the organization and its purpose. And I'd like to take a minute and read that to you. This is from his foreword. United Israel is acknowledged as the first American Jewish organization whose primary purpose is to educate non-Jews regarding the foundational faith of the Hebrew Bible and the values and prophetic ideals of the teachings of Moses and the biblical prophets. UIWU is a non-sectarian educational outreach now in its 75th year and still thriving with an active and impressive board of directors and a worldwide membership. Its goal is neither to convert non-Jews to Judaism nor to begin a new religion, but to represent to the broader world the prophetic vision of a universal house of prayer for all peoples founded on the ideals of the Torah and the prophets. It's a beautiful description. So I'd just like to add that United Israel World Union is a unique organization. And my wish for the Book of David is that it serve as an introduction and become another tool in helping us promote this wonderful organization. Reason number 4, no shelf life. As with biographies and autobiographies and history books, it has no use-by date, has no shelf life. It kind of just lives forever. It's there. You can still go back and read autobiographies of great men in the past. It stands as a permanent accounting of the unfolding events in the life of David Horowitz and his role in the affairs of the UN, the State of Israel, and United Israel World Union during the last half of the 20th century. And I believe that as long as United Israel World Union exists, the Book of David will stand also as a relevant compendium of the organization. Finally, reason number 5, it provides an explanation and answers about UIW. James just talked about that very point, about not really having an elevator talk about the organization. As a permanent piece of United Israel history, the book offers an answer to the many questions of, what is UIWU? How did they begin? What do they stand for? And who was David Horowitz? Well, it's the definitive piece for those who want to know more about the organization. So, we have the case for the Book of David. It's a book with many stories. If you've read it, there's a lot of history to cover. One of the things I worried about in writing the book is that it was so much history, so much ground to cover, that it would become dry and boring. But it is a book with many stories. It's the story of a man and the incredible legacy he left. It's the story of his unparalleled career as the dean of the UN Press Corps. One colleague once called him the institutional memory of the United Nations. Another called him Israel's watchman on the wall. It's the story of the organization he founded. This organization, now celebrating its 76th year. It's the story of his role in the founding and support of a fledgling Jewish state, a people back in their ancient homeland after 3,000 years. It's the story of an advocate for human rights and a champion in bringing Nazi war criminals to justice. And it chronicles the historical developments of one of the most amazing periods of human history, one in which many of us have lived a long time in, I would say, the latter half of the 20th century. Finally, on a personal note, I don't, and James covered a little bit about the proceeds. On a personal note, I don't want to take the view that this is a book I wrote, a book I feel good about and I hope it does well. Well, I do, and that's it's nice to have, but it's not my primary aspiration for the book. But that the book serves to document and preserve a lasting legacy of a remarkable man, a remarkable career, and a remarkable organization. I want to close with a little story, not in the book. Maybe I'll use it in the sequel to the sequel. In the early 1960s, David made several flights on Pan American World Airways. Anybody remember Pan American Airways? Do you ever fly on it? Now you can date yourself.
I got the blue bag.
The blue bag. Look. Pan American World Airways, not in existence today. He mentioned Pan Am in positive terms in several of his articles, in his syndicated columns. He called the planes the incomparable clipper ships. You remember they used to get the clipper fleet they would talk about? And David praised the humanitarian aspects and the remarkable service of the company. There was a reason for doing that. A little background. In 1927, a small airlines was founded by a man by the name of Juan Trippe in Key West, Florida. It was a little airlines to provide airmail and passenger service between Key West and Havana, Cuba. 40 years later, the little airline was known as Pan American World Airways and served an international market. Commonly known as Pan Am, it was the principal and largest international air carrier and the unofficial flag carrier of the United States. It was famous for its system of flying clippers. It was also famous for something else: the many incidents of aircraft hijackings and terrorist attacks. Most of us remember Pan Am Flight 103 that blew up over Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988. It was kind of the age of the early terrorist attacks, and planes were targets. Pan Am had their share. Well, one example of the humanitarian aspect of Pan American was the Pan Am wheelchair jets. It was a basketball team made up of paraplegics who were among some of the hundreds of physically handicapped people employed by the company. Very humanitarian company. They were coached by a former Globetrotter champion, Giannis Kellogg. They toured internationally. They competed in Special Olympics in Rome and other cities. Pan American had 12 jets reconfigured to accommodate the wheelchair team. In 1963, Pan Am sent this remarkable team to Israel, where it competed with a similar team of Israeli paraplegics in a tour of appearances around the country. The tour had a special impact on an entire generation of youngsters in Israel that had been marred with polio following the epidemic that blanketed the country in 1951. And of course, the Israeli War of Independence also had resulted in many handicapped soldiers. There were a lot of wheelchairs in Israel, a lot of crutches. Israel had a club by the name of the Spiwak Club. They had a wheelchair basketball team as well. They had won many trophies at international contests for the handicapped held in London, Rome, Tokyo, events known as Special Olympics. We have them today, don't we? Or at that time, Paralympics. Now, as the two teams toured the country, thousands of Israelis turned out for the games. Among them, hundreds of young polio victims that came out in crutches and in wheelchairs to watch. At Kibbutz Afakim, the entire population of 2,300 people turned out to watch the basketball game. Now, while the Pan Am wheelchair jets were competing against a team of Israeli wheelchair athletes, I missed my note here. Let me turn back. I should have said, you might recognize one such example of a victim during this period. He was an Israeli-American violinist, conductor, and music teacher by the name of Itzhak Perlman. Perlman was born in Tel Aviv, British Mandate, Palestine, in 1945, and he contracted polio at age 4. Now, while the Pan Am jets were in Israel, competing against the team of Israeli wheelchair jets, Itzhak Perlman was also performing in New York City on the Ed Sullivan Show. How many people are old enough to remember the Ed Sullivan Show? Whoa, I'm depressed. Yeah, and
Elvis and the Beatles.
Elvis and the Beatles. Well, Perlman appeared several times on the Ed Sullivan Show, and the last time was in 1964. On the same show as a young English rock band from London debuted, called themselves the Rolling Stones. Well, at the time, David Horowitz covered the wheelchair event. Don't know if any of you knew that. David covered those games. And he was very moved by the courage of the many victims and the humanitarian aspects of Pan Am. He spent time as the guest of Major and Mrs. Wellesley Aron. He was the Pan American representative in Israel. Spent time at their home in Tel Aviv. And another little-known fact, during the year of 1963, David Horowitz actually signed an agreement with Pan American World Airways for a writing assignment. He'd prepare articles and he'd prepare travel stories for Pan Am. They used it on their weekly travel series. And it also appeared in syndicated columns, one of which was B'nai B'rith Messenger. Pan American agreed to pay David $800 for the assignment. David wrote many articles for Pan Am about life and places in Israel. A few of them he included in the UI bulletins. One such article that jumped out at me was he wrote an article featuring the seaside resort of Eilat, situated on the very tip of the Negev. How many have been to Eilat? I know many of you have. Well, David stayed at a new luxury hotel that had been built in Eilat called the Queen of Sheba. Some of you have stayed there. James has stayed there. Now, you probably paid a little more than David paid at the time, because in 1964, he paid $12.50 a night. That included a full Israeli breakfast, which it probably does today. By the way, a new international airport has just opened in Eilat in January of this year. So now there's an alternative to just going into Tel Aviv. It was named Ramon Airport in memory of the first Israeli astronaut, Ilan Ramon, first Israeli astronaut, Ilan Ramon, who perished in the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster in 2003. Now, David loved that assignment, the opportunity, as he said, to see the faces of the people of a young and prosperous Israel, so full of hope, so full of courage, and to be able to capture it all for Pan Am. Often, David would find meaning and look for clues for things, numbers and things like that. He would find clues and he would say, yeah, no, good hand of providence, okay. Well, David remarked that the words Pan Am, in its abbreviated version, had a Hebraic ring to it. In Hebrew, it represented pani, faces, and of course, people. Pan Am, the faces of the people. But then David always viewed history through a biblical lens. I want you to know that it's been a privilege to speak to you this morning, and I want to thank you.
So I just want to let you know that this afternoon we'll have some of the books down. It really is a remarkable book. If you don't have it, I think we talked Ralph into bringing 30 of the hardcover and 30 of the paperback. So we'll have those throughout the conference. We'll get them downstairs and we'll work that out so you'll know about it. But just make sure that if you don't have it, you can pick it up here. You're going to be released for lunch. Released, that sounds a little bit like we're holding you now, but you have a short leash. But 2 p.m., if you can be back for 2, that's when I'm going to talk. And so we're going to go live at 2. So hopefully you'll be able. We have places you can eat here at the hotel. Right up the hill, there's a mall with a food court. Some of you brought your own food, some Shomar Shabbat. So there are different options, but please make sure that you're back by 2. Thank you very much.